Scott Hall had always prided himself on his life in Florence, South Carolina. His career as a police captain, respected by his colleagues and admired by the community, was everything he'd ever dreamed of. He had built a life based on order, responsibility, and family values. His home was a reflection of the successful man he had become. He and his wife, a woman he still loved deeply, lived in a comfortable suburban neighborhood where everything seemed perfect. Each day was much the same. Scott worked long hours, leaving early in the morning and returning home just in time for dinner. His wife, a beautiful woman with a kind smile, kept the house in order, attended church, and took care of their children. It was a life built on routine and trust. He didn't question it. But lately things had begun to shift, unnoticed at first. His wife's smile didn't reach her eyes as it once did. She seemed distant, wrapped up in something that Scott couldn't quite place. He told himself it was the stress of life, work, kids, responsibilities. After all, life had a way of wearing people down. Yet, there was something different, something he couldn't shake off. It was small things at first, an extra long day at the church, a phone call answered hurriedly, an offhand remark that seemed to carry more weight than it should have. He brushed it off, telling himself it was nothing. But as the days passed, Scott couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. One evening, as he walked through the door after a particularly difficult shift, he noticed his wife sitting on the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't greet him immediately, her eyes glued to the screen. Scott gave her a kiss on the cheek, but she barely reacted. This wasn't the woman he'd married, the woman who had once rushed to meet him at the door with a smile. "Long day?" Scott asked, trying to strike up conversation. He wanted to feel the connection they once shared, but the words felt hollow as they left his lips. "Yeah," she replied, her voice flat. "Just busy." Scott knew better than to press her further. She had always been the strong one, the one who handled everything with grace. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, he thought. As the evening wore on, he tried to push the unease from his mind, chalking it up to the weariness that came with a demanding life. But as he settled into the couch beside her, a strange feeling lingered. It was subtle, like a whisper in the back of his mind, but it wouldn't go away. For the first time in years, Scott Hall felt like he was a stranger in his own home. The discomfort that had once been a fleeting sensation in Scott's mind was now a constant, nagging presence. He found himself replaying every moment, looking for signs of something more, something he didn't want to see. It wasn't just the coldness that had crept into his wife's behavior. It was the subtle changes. Her late nights at the church had started to feel more like an excuse than a genuine commitment. Her texts and phone calls had grown more secretive, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. One night, as Scott came home earlier than usual, he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in her hands. She quickly dropped it when she heard him enter, but he had seen the notification, a name he didn't recognize. It was the pastor. A wave of unease surged through him. He had learned to ignore his doubts, but they had taken root now, festering in the back of his mind. He tried to brush it off, tried to chalk it up to overthinking, but something inside him told him he was missing something crucial. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and they were starting to sprout. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, he couldn't help but notice her smile, wide and genuine, as she typed something on her phone. The smile was directed at the screen, not at him. It was the same smile she used to give him, the one that had always made him feel like the center of her world. Now, it was being given to someone else. "Who are you texting?" Scott asked, his voice lighter than he felt. His wife looked up, startled. Her eyes flitted nervously, as if caught off guard by the question. "Oh, just a friend," she replied too quickly. "Nothing important." But Scott didn't believe her. He had seen that look before. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she seemed to pull away from him when he asked her simple questions. He knew her too well to be fooled. "Just a friend?" Scott echoed, his voice thick with doubt. His chest tightened as he thought about the pastor, someone Scott had always trusted and respected. It felt like a betrayal on a level he couldn't quite articulate. How could she do this to him, to them? "I'll leave you to it," he said, his voice now steady, though the storm brewing inside him was anything but calm. He turned away before she could respond, retreating to the kitchen, where the familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. But even as the evening passed, the questions lingered. He knew he had to get answers. The doubt gnawed at him relentlessly. It wasn't just the phone call or the texts. It was the distance, the coldness, the absence of warmth that had once been so prominent in their relationship. She had become someone else, someone he no longer recognized, and all the while Scott had been blind to it. By the time he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, he was already planning what to do next. He couldn't go on pretending he hadn't noticed. He needed to confront her, to face whatever this was head-on. But as the doubts swirled in his mind, so did the questions about what he might find. Was it just his imagination, or was there something deeper, darker, hiding behind her words and actions? The seed of doubt had been planted, and Scott knew there was no turning back now. Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every glance, every fleeting moment between his wife and the pastor, it all added up, each tiny detail pushing him closer to the edge of doubt. He told himself he was overthinking things, but when he saw her laughing at a message on her phone again that evening, he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The smile was too genuine, too familiar, and it was not for him. It was for someone else. That night, as she went to bed early, Scott stayed up, wrestling with himself. His thoughts were a blur, hurt, confusion, and anger swirling into a storm. He had always trusted his wife. They had built a life together. How could she betray him like this? He waited until he was sure she was asleep, then quietly grabbed her phone from the bedside table. His hands trembled as he unlocked it, the light from the screen illuminating the darkness of the room. The screen flickered with recent messages, most of them unread. Scott's heart raced, each second stretching into eternity as he scrolled through the texts. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the name, Pastor John. The familiar pang of jealousy gnawed at him. He hesitated before clicking open the message. He read the words slowly, each sentence making his stomach drop further. I miss you so much. Can't wait to see you again soon. You look so beautiful today. I'm thinking of you, every moment. The smile on her face that night, the secrecy, it all came rushing back clearer than ever. His worst fears had come true. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted for so long, had betrayed him with the one man he had trusted most in their community. Scott's chest tightened as a wave of nausea hit him. He stared at the phone, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He felt like he was drowning in his own anger and disbelief. The tears that had been threatening to fall for days finally broke through. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of hurt, of feeling utterly helpless. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to stop reading, to confront her right then and there. But he couldn't. The words on the screen were like a spell he couldn't break. He was frozen. His thoughts raced. He could confront her, demand answers right away. But then what? What would he say? How would she justify it? And why would she do this? His mind didn't have the answers, but his heart already knew. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a fling. This was something more, something deep, something that cut straight to the core. He closed the phone, his hands shaking as he placed it back on the table. He lay down beside her, pretending to sleep, but his mind was running 1,000 miles per minute. How had he missed this? How could she have done this to him? He stared at the ceiling, his mind a blur of thoughts. The doubt that had once been a small, nagging feeling was now a force consuming him. He could no longer turn a blind eye. The seed of suspicion had sprouted, and there was no way to stop it from growing. As the minutes dragged on, Scott felt a storm brewing inside of him. His emotions were all over the place. Disbelief, sadness, anger, and a sense of betrayal that he couldn't put into words. How could he face her? How could he confront the person who had shared his life for so long, only to find out she had been hiding something so massive, so painful from him? He finally fell into an uneasy sleep, but the question still haunted him, unanswered. The storm inside of him didn't calm. It only intensified. He had to know the truth. He had to know what had been going on behind his back. Tomorrow, he would confront her. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. Scott stood in the driveway, his breath shallow and fast. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as the weight of what he'd discovered weighed heavily on his mind. His pulse raced with a mixture of dread and determination as he approached the church. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't live with the questions any longer. He needed answers from the one person who could confirm his worst fear, the pastor. The church was quiet, the doors locked, but Scott knew where to find him. He had known Pastor John for years. The man had been a friend, a mentor even. It wasn't just a betrayal of his wife, it was a betrayal of everything Scott had trusted. The pastor, a man of the cloth, someone he had leaned on during tough times, had taken that trust and shattered it. He walked into the church office, the smell of incense still lingering in the air. The pastor was there, sitting at his desk, his back to Scott as he spoke on the phone. Scott's presence went unnoticed at first, but as the door clicked shut, the pastor turned. His eyes widened briefly before he tried to mask the surprise with a smile. "Scott, what are you doing here?" the pastor asked, his voice almost too calm. Scott didn't respond right away. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. There was so much he wanted to say, so much rage and hurt that needed an outlet. But all he could do was stare at the man who had so easily stolen everything from him. "I need to know why," Scott said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "Why her? Why did you do this? Why her?" Pastor John's face flickered with uncertainty, but he quickly composed himself. "Scott, I didn't plan for it to happen. It was never supposed to be like this." Scott's stomach churned. The man who had once helped him, guided him through his darkest moments, was now standing in front of him, admitting to a betrayal so deep it left Scott feeling hollow. "It wasn't just a few texts, was it?" Scott continued, his voice breaking through the tension in the room. "It wasn't just a couple of late-night conversations. You were involved with her, emotionally, physically. You took everything that mattered to me." The pastor lowered his gaze, unable to meet Scott's eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, suffocating in its weight. "Why?" Scott repeated, his voice more strained now. "Why my wife? You knew what we had. You knew how much I trusted you." The pastor swallowed hard. "I wasn't looking for this. I was just trying to be there for her. She was lonely, Scott. You were always working, and He stopped himself, his voice faltering. "I didn't intend for it to go this far. It just did." Scott stepped forward, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "And now? What now? Are you going to tell me it was all a mistake, a miscommunication?" Pastor John stood up, clearly unsettled, his hands raised defensively. "Scott, I'm sorry, I really am, but I care about her. I didn't want any of this. But I can't change what happened." The words stung. Scott wanted to lash out, but something in the pastor's face made him hesitate. There was no remorse in his eyes, just the recognition of a mistake he couldn't undo. He had crossed a line, and now they both had to face the consequences. Scott's world spun. He had always trusted this man, considered him a friend, a spiritual guide. To learn that his wife had confided in him, leaned on him for comfort, while Scott had been blind to it, was more than he could bear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Scott asked quietly, the hurt in his voice raw and exposed. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you just tell me she was struggling?" The pastor's eyes flickered, and for the first time, Scott saw a hint of guilt in his expression. "I didn't know how. She didn't want me to tell you. She said she couldn't come to you because of your work." Scott shook his head. "She couldn't come to me, so she turned to you." The pastor's face turned pale. "I didn't want this to happen, but by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to pull back." Scott stood there, absorbing the words, each one landing like a punch. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, and his mind screamed at him for not noticing sooner. But in that moment, in the thick silence that filled the space between them, Scott realized something else. He didn't just want answers. He wanted revenge. He wanted to make them both feel the pain he was drowning in. Before he could stop himself, Scott turned away, his mind made up. The feeling of betrayal now consumed him. His world was crumbling, and the man who had once been his friend was partly responsible. "Stay away from my wife," Scott said, his voice cold, without emotion. And stay away from me. This isn't over, not by a long shot." The pastor stood frozen as Scott walked out of the room, the door slamming behind him. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, but there was no turning back. Scott had crossed the point of no return. Scott couldn't shake the image of the pastor's face as he walked out of the church. The man he had trusted, confided in, and respected had just admitted to destroying everything Scott had worked for. It was as if the very foundation of his life had cracked beneath him, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The reality of the betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the overwhelming weight of it all. His wife, his supposed best friend, had broken him in a way that words couldn't describe. Driving back to his house, Scott's thoughts were racing, clashing like thunder in a storm. His fists clenched around the steering wheel as his mind replayed every single moment, every conversation, every lie. He could feel his chest tightening, his heart racing. Anger boiled within him, but there was also an overwhelming sense of despair. He had been so blind, so trusting. How had he not seen it? How had he not known that something was wrong? The front door of his house loomed ahead as he pulled into the driveway. His mind screamed at him to leave, to just keep driving. But he didn't. He couldn't. His feet were already moving toward the door before his brain could process it. Inside, the house felt like a stranger's home. The familiar sounds, the warmth of the place he once felt at peace in, it all felt hollow now. The place that had been his sanctuary now felt like a prison. As he stepped into the living room, he saw his wife sitting there, her back turned to him, her head down. She hadn't even noticed he was home. "Am I supposed to just pretend nothing happened?" Scott's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence. His wife didn't look up. "I'm sorry, Scott," she said softly, her words barely audible. "I never meant for you to find out this way. It was just, I was lonely. And he was there when I needed someone." Loneliness. The words burned through him, a deep, sharp pain that left him breathless. She had justified it in her mind, just as he had justified his work and his long hours. But now it was all laid bare. The truth was an ugly thing, a thing that crushed the very core of what he had thought was a strong, loving marriage. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this," Scott muttered, the weight of his own words pulling at him. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bear to see her face, the woman who had once been the love of his life, now standing as a symbol of betrayal. She turned toward him, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Scott. Please just don't leave me. I need you." The desperation in her voice made him feel a pang of guilt, but it wasn't enough to erase the fury that consumed him. "You needed me. How could you say that? You didn't need me. You had someone else to run to. You chose him." Her sobs filled the room, but Scott couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Every time he thought about the pastor's words, his own mind became a storm of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and self-loathing. How could he have let this happen? The questions spiraled, crashing into each other. He walked out of the room, unable to stay any longer. His thoughts were suffocating him. He couldn't stay in the house, not with her in it, not with everything that had happened hanging between them like a suffocating cloud. As Scott left the house, the night air hit him like a cold slap. He walked aimlessly, his mind refusing to settle, unable to process the reality of his situation. His entire life, his entire world, felt like it was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. He didn't know where to go, what to do. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes narrowing as he saw the message. It was from the pastor. His mind raced. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to speak to the man who had torn apart everything he cared about. The message read, "I'm sorry, Scott. I never meant for it to go this far. Please, understand." But there was nothing left to understand. Scott's fingers hovered over the screen, his rage flaring. The words came faster than he could think, as if his mind was disconnected from his actions. "You've taken everything from me. It's over." He slammed the phone shut, feeling the weight of the finality in his words. He couldn't do this anymore. The trust, the love, it was gone. And what had it all been for? To watch it crumble in the face of one simple, devastating truth? As he walked away from the house, the darkness around him seemed to echo his inner turmoil. The anger was growing, burning deep inside him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't outrun the truth. He had been betrayed. He had been broken. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Scott's mind was a storm of emotions as he drove towards the pastor's house. The rage inside him burned hotter with every passing second. He had always trusted Pastor John. He had treated him like a brother, confided in him during difficult times, and now, the very man who had once comforted him had shattered his life. It wasn't just the affair, it was the sense of betrayal, the knowing that the person who had been his guide had used that position to manipulate and destroy everything Scott held dear. As Scott pulled up to the pastor's home, he slammed the car into park and stepped out. The air was thick with tension. His steps were fast, deliberate. His fists clenched as he walked up to the door. The sight of it, the place that had once been a symbol of respect, now felt like the setting for something far darker. He knocked on the door, the sound of it echoing in the quiet night. There was a brief pause before the door creaked open. Pastor John stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and fear. He hadn't expected Scott to come here, not after their last conversation. But Scott was past the point of reasoning. The anger that had simmered for days was now boiling over, and he couldn't keep it in anymore. "You're the one who ruined everything," Scott spat, his voice tight with fury. "You took her from me, John. You took everything I trusted, everything I worked for." The pastor's face turned pale, his eyes shifting nervously. "Scott, please, calm down. Let's talk about this. It was a mistake. We didn't mean for it to go this far." The calmness in the pastor's voice only enraged Scott more. How could he stand there pretending like this was all some misunderstanding? This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something that could be fixed with words. "You knew what you were doing," Scott hissed, stepping closer. His fists were now clenched at his sides. "You knew what this would do to me, to us, to everything." Pastor John took a small step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Scott, you're angry, I understand, but this doesn't have to get violent. We can figure this out." "Figure it out," Scott interrupted, his voice rising. "What is there to figure out? You slept with my wife. You destroyed everything." The pastor took another step back, eyes wide. "I trusted you," Scott shouted. "I let you into my life, my home, and you took advantage of that. You think you can just apologize and make it go away?" The words hit the pastor hard, and for a moment he looked genuinely remorseful. But Scott wasn't finished. He couldn't hold back anymore. The anger that had been building for days, for weeks, finally exploded in a burst of fury. Before the pastor could say anything more, Scott pushed him against the wall, his grip tightening on the collar of his shirt. The shock on the pastor's face only made Scott angrier. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Scott's voice was low, dangerous. "You think I'll just let you get away with it? I gave you my trust and you betrayed me." The pastor's breath quickened, but Scott didn't let go. His body was shaking with adrenaline, with rage, with all the feelings he had bottled up for so long. The pastor stammered, his voice trembling. "Scott, please, this isn't you. You don't want to do this." "I don't want to." Scott's eyes narrowed, his voice dangerously calm now. "You don't get to tell me what I want. You took everything from me. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The pastor's hands went up in surrender, but Scott wasn't finished. He shoved him once more, feeling the satisfaction of his anger venting. But there was something else creeping in, a dark, overwhelming sense of powerlessness that made his actions seem even more uncontrollable. For a brief moment, everything was still. The pastor looked at him with wide eyes, fear evident on his face. Scott's mind raced, his body trembling from the emotional storm. What had he done? What was happening to him? Then, the moment passed. His anger hadn't subsided, it was just building. He stepped back, breathing heavily. The pastor rubbed his neck, still wide-eyed, his hands shaking. Scott watched him for a moment, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Don't come near my family again," Scott growled, his voice steady, cold. "Stay the hell away from her." He turned sharply and walked out, the door slamming behind him. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and the adrenaline left him breathless. He felt sick, but he didn't care. The anger that had taken hold of him felt like a strange, almost addictive force. He had just physically confronted the man who had ruined his life, and yet it didn't feel like enough. It never would. As Scott drove away, his mind replayed the scene, the pastor's fear, the way he had crumbled under the weight of Scott's anger. But even as the anger started to fade, another emotion grew, something darker, more dangerous. It was a thirst for revenge that would consume him. The house felt like a stranger's home when Scott returned. Every step he took felt heavy. He knew what he had to do now, but it wasn't just about confronting his wife. It was about reclaiming the life he had lost, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. Scott's hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove away from the pastor's house. His heart was still pounding, the adrenaline slowly fading into a sickening calm. The world outside seemed distant, as though everything was muffled and far away. The only thing he could hear was the sound of his own thoughts, crashing together like waves in a storm. The confrontation had happened so fast, too fast for him to process. He had seen the fear in the pastor's eyes, and a part of him relished it. But now that feeling had passed, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He had done what he had to do, right? The betrayal, the years of lies, the manipulation. It had all led him here. The rage that had burned in him now felt like an insatiable void, consuming everything he once held dear. And yet, the satisfaction of confronting the man who had torn apart his life was fleeting. There was no catharsis, no release from the pain that still gnawed at his insides. As he pulled into his driveway, Scott's thoughts wandered back to his wife. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened. But could he really face her after everything? The thought of her face, the guilt, the remorse in her eyes filled him with a mixture of anger and sadness. Could they ever fix this? Could they ever go back to what they had? The answer was clear, but Scott wasn't ready to accept it yet. He walked into the house, the door creaking shut behind him. The familiar warmth of their home felt suffocating now, like a trap. His wife was sitting in the living room, waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but there was no shock in her expression. She had known something was coming. "Scott, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you like this. I never meant for it to get this far." Scott's jaw clenched. Her words echoed in his mind, but they didn't feel real anymore. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a simple slip-up. This was betrayal. This was a complete rupture of everything they had built together. "I know," he said, his voice cold, barely more than a rasp. "But it doesn't change anything." His wife's face crumpled as she stood, reaching out to him. "Please, don't say that. Please, just listen." "No," Scott cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. He couldn't let her get too close. He couldn't look at her and feel that same affection anymore. Not after what she had done. Not after what she had allowed to happen. "You don't get to tell me how to feel. Not anymore." She recoiled, her face a mask of regret and fear. "Scott, please. I never wanted to lose you. I was so lonely. I needed someone, and he was there for me." Scott clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Lonely?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "We had a family, a life, and you go to him? How long did this go on? How long was I blind to it?" "I never wanted you to find out like this," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I'm so sorry." But her words didn't soothe him. They only deepened the ache that already gnawed at his insides. The tears in her eyes didn't bring him comfort. They only reminded him of how powerless he felt. He had trusted her. He had trusted them both. And now, all of that was gone. Scott paced across the room, his thoughts spiraling. Every moment they had shared, every laugh, every kiss, was now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. There was no going back, no forgiving what had been done. "You don't get it," Scott muttered, more to himself than to her. "I can't just forget this. I can't just pretend like everything's fine. You did this. You destroyed everything." His wife sank back into the chair, her hands covering her face as she cried. The sight of her in such distress should have moved him, but all it did was stir more anger. Anger at her, at the pastor, at himself for not seeing the truth sooner. Scott turned away, unable to look at her any longer. "I don't know what to do anymore. I can't even look at you right now." Without waiting for her reply, he walked out of the room. His feet carried him to the front door, and he stepped outside into the cold night air. The world around him felt like it was slipping into chaos. There was no escape from the pain, no release from the betrayal that weighed him down. The wind whipped through the trees, but it did nothing to calm his racing thoughts. Scott felt like he was drowning in his own emotions, trapped by the weight of his anger, his pain, and the realization that everything he had known was gone. He walked aimlessly, not sure where he was going or why he was even walking at all. His thoughts were a whirlwind, everything colliding into one single feeling: loss. His life, his love, his trust. It had all been shattered in a moment of weakness. As the hours passed, Scott found himself standing at the edge of the park, looking out over the quiet town. His heart felt heavy, his mind consumed by the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. The life he had once known, the family he had loved, was now broken beyond repair. The weight of his choices, his anger, and his pain pressed down on him like a 100-ton stone. There was no turning back. He had already crossed the line. There was no going back to the way things were. The following days blurred together for Scott. The chaos in his mind had not subsided. It had only intensified. He barely slept, his thoughts consumed with the betrayal, the anger, and the overwhelming urge for answers. But he wasn't the only one searching for the truth now. The police had started their own investigation, and what they uncovered quickly shifted the narrative Scott had been living. It all began with a routine check into the crime scene. 2 bodies, one in a carefully staged home. At first, it seemed like a simple case of a failed robbery. The front door had been left ajar, and valuables were missing. But the detectives were too seasoned to take the first story at face value. They noticed things that Scott had missed, small inconsistencies that seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no signs that a thief had rifled through the house. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. And then there was the blood, splattered in a way that didn't quite match the initial theory of a robbery gone wrong. It didn't make sense. Detective Carter, the lead investigator, was methodical and relentless. He quickly dug into Scott's background, his career, his relationship with his wife, and any potential motives. He spoke with neighbors, co-workers, and friends, and it didn't take long before a pattern started to emerge. Scott's life, once viewed through the lens of respectability, was now under a microscope. Detective Carter learned of Scott's troubled relationship with his wife, how she had been distant in recent months, how her behavior had changed. He also found out about the pastor. The quiet man who had once been a fixture in the community was now the center of the investigation. The affair was a thread that needed to be pulled, and as it unraveled, it began to reveal more than anyone had anticipated. Scott hadn't thought of the pastor as a threat until it was too late. Pastor John had been more than just a confidant. He had been a participant in the destruction of Scott's world. The detective spoke to people who had seen them together, who had heard rumors of an emotional relationship long before Scott ever discovered the truth. When Carter visited the church, he found more than just spiritual guidance being offered. There were reports from staff members who had seen the pastor and Scott's wife in private conversations, lingering in corners, exchanging touches that seemed more intimate than they should have been. The rumors painted a picture of a relationship that had gone too far. The most damning piece of evidence came when Carter interviewed the church secretary. She had seen the pastor and Scott's wife together on multiple occasions, not just at church, but outside of it. It was clear that their relationship had crossed a line. By the time Carter confronted Scott, the pieces had already started to fall into place. Scott's initial story was unraveling, and the cracks in his alibi were becoming impossible to ignore. "I've been through your timeline," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "You've told us you were at home all night, but that doesn't add up with the evidence we have." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Your wife and the pastor were closer than you think, and the moment you walked into that house, you both knew the truth was coming out." Scott felt his heart race, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He didn't know how much Carter knew, but the air in the room was thick with suspicion. Every word that came from the detective's mouth made Scott feel smaller, cornered. "I didn't kill them," Scott said, his voice shaking, though he tried to hold his composure. "I was angry, but I didn't kill them." The detective raised an eyebrow. "But you were there, weren't you?" Carter's eyes narrowed, and the weight of his words hung in the air. "You found out about the affair. You found out the man you trusted was the one tearing your life apart." Scott's mind raced. He hadn't planned for any of this. The rage had overtaken him, a blind, uncontrollable force. But the pieces were all fitting together in ways he couldn't undo. He hadn't killed them, but he had pushed them to a breaking point. He had forced the confrontation. He had been the one to walk into their lives, to set it all in motion. "I didn't kill them," Scott repeated, the words coming out like a mantra. But even as he said it, he knew the truth was far more complicated than that. Carter stood, his face a mask of calm determination. "You've said that before, but you're going to have to prove it, because right now, everything points to you." The detective walked out of the room, leaving Scott to sit in the silence that followed. His world, once clear and controlled, was now a tangled mess of lies and betrayal. The investigation was only beginning, but already Scott knew there was no escaping what was coming next. Scott sat alone in the interrogation room, the cold metal chair creaking under his weight as he waited for the next round of questioning. Detective Carter had left the room hours ago, but the silence that followed felt more suffocating than anything he had experienced before. His mind was clouded, overwhelmed by the mess of lies and betrayal that had become his life. Every question from Carter, every accusation only deepened the pit in his stomach. He had been through this before, but now it felt different. There was something more coming, something he wasn't prepared for. The door swung open and Carter stepped in, his face unreadable. In his hand was a manila folder, and he sat down across from Scott with a slow, deliberate motion. There was a quiet tension in the room now, something far more intense than their previous conversations. "You're a good man, Scott," Carter said, his voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "But you've been hiding something." Scott's heart skipped a beat. For a moment he didn't respond. His mind raced and he suddenly felt the walls closing in. He couldn't afford another slip-up, not now, not when the whole story seemed to be slipping from his grasp. He swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" Scott asked, his voice almost too calm, masking the unease that had settled in his chest. Carter opened the folder, pulling out a series of photographs. They were grainy, taken from a security camera at a convenience store just outside town. Scott leaned forward, his stomach tightening as he recognized the figures. There, on the screen, was his wife, walking beside a woman he didn't know. They were talking, laughing even, as they shared a moment in the dimly lit parking lot. But that wasn't what caught Scott's attention. No. What hit him like a punch to the gut was the woman standing next to his wife. It was the secretary from the church. His mind went numb as he stared at the photo. What is this?" Scott asked, his voice cracking. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence settle between them. Finally, he spoke, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Turns out," Carter began, "your wife wasn't the only one involved in this affair. The pastor wasn't just playing with your trust, Scott. There's someone else." He paused for a moment, watching Scott's reaction. "The secretary at the church. She's been with him too." Scott sat frozen, the weight of the new revelation sinking in. His wife wasn't just having an affair with the pastor. There was a web of deceit, a whole new level to the betrayal that he hadn't anticipated. The secretary, a trusted member of the church, had been part of the lies, part of the secrecy that had destroyed everything Scott believed in. "But why?" Scott whispered, his voice shaking. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't you?" "I didn't know until now," Carter interjected, his voice steady but laced with the same frustration Scott was feeling. "But this woman, your wife's friend, has been in this from the start. She was the one who encouraged your wife to get closer to the pastor. She's been covering it up for months." Scott ran his hands through his hair, the overwhelming shock making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the affair, it was the conspiracy, the years of lies piled on top of each other. His wife had betrayed him, the pastor had betrayed him, and now the church secretary? The woman who had been so sweet, so caring. She was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. The room felt smaller now. Every breath Scott took felt heavier. So, you think she was part of it all along? Carter nodded, flipping through more papers. We've got surveillance footage. She's been meeting with the pastor more than you think. And your wife? She wasn't the only one who wanted him. Scott's thoughts scrambled. There was too much to take in. Too many lies, too many people involved. The web of deceit had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just a simple affair. It was a conspiracy, a betrayal at every level, and it felt like the floor had been pulled out from under him. I'm going to need you to come with us, Carter said softly but with finality. We've got enough evidence now to bring her in too. Scott stared at the detective, his mind whirling. The last thing he had expected was this. The secretary. A third person. How had he been so blind to it all? His life, the one he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling under the weight of secrets, lies, and manipulation. As Scott stood up, the reality of his situation settled in. The betrayal, the affair, it had all been worse than he could have imagined. And now, with this new twist, he couldn't see how things would ever go back to normal. Could he trust anyone? Could he ever go back to the life he had before all of this? Carter turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back at Scott. I'm sorry, Scott. This is going to get worse before it gets better. But the truth will come out. You just have to let it. Scott stood still, his world unraveling around him, and for the first time he wasn't sure if there was any way back from this. The truth was dark and complicated, and it wasn't just about what happened, it was about everything that had been hidden. The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Scott sat at the defendant's table, his face expressionless, yet his heart raced in his chest. He was surrounded by people who had once respected him, people who had once looked up to him as a pillar of the community. Now they were the ones who would judge him. His career, his life, everything he had worked for, was now in the hands of 12 strangers. The sound of murmurs filled the space as the judge entered, signaling for everyone to rise. Scott barely noticed the formality of the proceedings. His mind kept drifting back to the events that had led him here. The confrontation with his wife, the rage he had felt, the betrayal by Pastor John, and the secret affair with the secretary. Each memory was like a stab in the heart, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the trial, those feelings overshadowed everything. The trial had begun weeks ago, but it still felt like a blur. The testimonies had been delivered, each one a revelation of the brokenness of his marriage, his life, and everything he had believed in. The prosecutor had painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by jealousy and rage, unable to cope with the truth of his wife's affair. Scott had never been a violent man, but the prosecutor argued that it was Scott's inability to deal with the emotional turmoil that led him to commit murder. You don't know what it's like, Scott whispered under his breath, but there was no one to hear his words. He didn't even know if he was speaking to anyone at all. The weight of guilt, regret, and confusion pressed down on him, suffocating him in the cold silence of the courtroom. The defense had been weak. His lawyer had tried to argue that Scott wasn't in his right mind, that his emotional state at the time of the killings had led to an uncontrollable outburst. But how could he explain the actions that had followed? How could anyone truly understand the mind of a man who had lost everything, who had been torn apart by the people closest to him? As the trial progressed, Scott's wife was called to the stand. She had been reluctant at first, her eyes red from the sleepless nights, but she knew she had to testify. Her voice cracked as she recounted the events that led to that fateful night. She spoke of her own guilt, her remorse, and her inability to make things right. But she didn't speak of the affair with the same intensity. She didn't speak of the man who had been her confidant, her partner in betrayal, and that, more than anything, left Scott feeling empty. She wasn't telling the full truth. She wasn't revealing the extent of the lies that had destroyed them both. Did you know what your husband would do when he found out? The prosecutor asked, his voice cold, calculated. She hesitated before answering, and for a brief moment Scott saw a flicker of the woman he had once loved. No, she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I never thought he would. I never thought it would come to this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Scott's mind went blank. He had never thought it would come to this either. He had never thought his life would crumble into a tangled mess of lies, deceit, and rage. He had never imagined that he would stand in a courtroom, the world he had built for himself and his family now reduced to nothing more than a series of questions with no answers. The trial continued for days, each witness adding a new layer to the story. The prosecutor painted Scott as a man who had lost control, while the defense argued that he was a victim of circumstances, driven to madness by the betrayal of those he trusted most. The truth, it seemed, was somewhere in between, but neither side was willing to accept it. When it was finally Scott's turn to take the stand, he was a shell of the man he had once been. His eyes were dull, his face gaunt, and every word he spoke felt like it came from a distant place, somewhere beyond the anger, beyond the hurt. He didn't even know if he could answer the questions truthfully anymore. His mind was clouded by so many conflicting emotions: guilt, rage, fear, confusion. "I didn't want to kill them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want any of this, but I couldn't stop myself." The words felt like an admission of guilt, but they were the truth. Scott had never intended for things to go this far. He hadn't wanted to lose everything. But in that moment of pure, unrelenting rage, he had crossed a line. And once he had crossed it, there was no turning back. The jury deliberated for hours. The pressure was unbearable, each minute stretching into an eternity. Scott could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment that came with the knowledge that his life had been torn apart, that his actions had led to the destruction of everything he had worked for. When the verdict finally came, Scott's heart stopped beating for a moment. He was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, a crime of passion, but a crime nonetheless. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As the gavel fell, Scott felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't relief, it wasn't justice. It was something far more hollow, a recognition that everything he had done, everything he had built, had been for nothing. Scott sat in his prison cell, the cold concrete walls closing in around him like a suffocating weight. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the corners of his mind. He hadn't slept much since the trial ended, his body too exhausted, his mind too restless. The sentence had been handed down, 25 years. 25 years in a place that felt like a world far removed from the life he had once known. In the silence of the cell, Scott couldn't help but replay everything that had led him to this moment. The life he had once built, the love he had believed in, now lay in ruins, shattered beyond recognition. The betrayal, the affair, the violent confrontation. It all felt like a series of disconnected events, moments he wished he could take back but knew he couldn't. His thoughts turned to his wife. He had once seen her as the one person who truly understood him, the one person who shared his dreams and fears. But now, she was a distant memory, a ghost of the woman he had married. He couldn't bring himself to hate her, though. Maybe it was because deep down he knew he had failed her too. He had been so consumed with his work, so focused on his own career, that he had failed to notice the cracks in their marriage, the emotional distance growing between them. He had been blind to it, just as blind as he had been to the affair. He thought of the pastor, the man who had been his friend, his mentor. Pastor John had been more than just a religious leader to Scott. He had been a confidant, a man he had trusted with his deepest thoughts and struggles. And yet, that same man had destroyed everything Scott held dear, using his position to manipulate and deceive. The betrayal stung deeply, but in the quiet of the cell, Scott realized that the pain he felt from the pastor's actions was nothing compared to the pain of losing his family. There was a cold realization now. The truth was never simple. It was a tangled mess of choices, of missed opportunities, of broken trust. Scott had always believed in the concept of justice, in the idea that if you worked hard and played by the rules, things would turn out right. But now, sitting in this cell, he understood that sometimes justice was just a word, a hollow concept that never quite lived up to its promise. He thought about the trial, about the cold, calculating words of the prosecutor. He had been painted as a man driven to madness, overwhelmed by his emotions. The defense had tried to argue that he wasn't in control of his actions, that the anger and heartbreak had taken over. But deep down, Scott knew better. He had made a choice. No matter how much pain he had felt, no matter how justified his anger had seemed in the moment, he had crossed a line. And once he had crossed that line, there was no going back. Scott closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing heavily on his chest. He had lost everything, and now he had to pay the price. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been the one to destroy his own life. His wife, the pastor, even the secretary. None of them had forced him into the choices he made. He had chosen his actions, his responses, and now he was left with the consequences. The anger he had felt in the moments after the discovery of the affair, the anger that had driven him to confront both his wife and the pastor, seemed so far away now. What had it all been for? To feel vindicated in the moment, to strike back at the people who had hurt him. It had all been so hollow. In the quiet of the prison, Scott realized that the only thing left now was the long road ahead, the years of reflection, the years of wondering how everything had gone so terribly wrong. His mind wandered back to his children. He thought about the family he had lost, the life they would now grow up without him. Would they understand? Would they ever know what had happened to their father? He hoped they would, but a part of him feared they never would. He was no longer the man he had once been. As Scott sat in his cell, his eyes closed once more, he realized that his journey wasn't over. The punishment he faced in prison was just a part of the story. The real punishment, the one that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was the realization that he had broken everything that had ever mattered to him. His life, his family, his trust, they were all gone. The reflection in his mind wasn't one of anger or regret. It was simply acceptance. He had made his choices. Now he would live with them. What do you think of Scott Hall's actions in this heartbreaking story? Do you believe his rage was justified, or was it a tragic mistake? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below.